different people like say, oh, like Greece or these countries that have, gone through fiscal crises and because they've been so in debt. The U.S. is different in the sense that our debt is all in dollars. I mean, we're certainly seeing signs of real problems. We need to raise the debt limit just because we can't just balance the budget today, right? I mean, that would be hugely traumatic to the economy. The bill, I refuse to call it the big beautiful, but the tax and spending bill, 70% of it or so goes to the richest 1%.
Today, I'm joined by Michael Ettlinger, a public policy expert, educator, and a political advisor in the United States. He's also a senior fellow at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Nice to be with you.
Today, I was hoping to discuss some of the big fiscal issues that United States is facing, as well as the current Trump administration is tackling the situation. And lastly, what are some additional policy advice that you might have for the current administration?
Shoot.
Perfect. I know you wrote a lot about how Trump's proposed tax reform would penalize the poor people and then really reward the wealthy on the top. I wanted to understand a little bit more why a growing wealth inequality gap is a bad thing for the economy health as a whole, and how does it affect all kinds of Americans?
Wealth and income inequality, which tend to go hand in hand, are important for a few reasons. I mean, one is just in terms of the well-being of most people. If, sort of simple logic and math, if the benefits of the economy are overwhelmingly flowing to the top, that means other people are not benefiting as well as they might. There's also a very real problem, and this has been seen, historically, and that with excessive concentrations of wealth and income come concentrations of power and political power. And there's real problems with what's called rent seeking in the economy, that once the power becomes so concentrated, the people with that power can sort of use the instrumentalities of government to kind of perpetuate their wealth and further expand wealth inequality. And that really ends up being bad for the economy writ large, because you end up, call me a capitalist, but if markets are not deciding where resources are allocated, but instead just brute power of government in the hands of the wealthiest and the most privileged people, that's actually bad for the overall economy and overall growth.
Something also that I've heard, and I don't know how true or how big that impact is, but ultimately, if you don't have that much money, you end up spending all the money that you have buying stuff. If you have a lot of money, there's so much stuff that you need, so you end up just kind of hoarding it. Is it really a big factor when wealth inequality really increases? There are just businesses that are suffering because nobody's buying their product because it's concentrated at hands that are just buying assets instead of consumption goods?
Yeah, I mean, you do have, there's always this focus on investment as fueling economic growth. I mean, sort of supply side approach on the investment side. But at some point, you end up with extreme distributions of wealth and income with, why are you going to invest in a business that produces goods if there's no one can afford the goods? So, I mean, the sort of the sweet spot for an economy is when people have enough money to consume and there are resources available to make investments to sort of feed that, to feed that consumption. So it's that's the kind of cycle you want in an economy. You need both supply and demand, So yeah, absolutely, that can become at the extremes can become a problem. Henry Ford was famous for saying he wanted to pay his people enough so that they could afford to buy the cars they made. And he was no left-wing radical, to say the least. But he had at some level of recognition that for the economy to work, if just the owners of the factory are just extracting all of the benefits, or hugely disproportionate share of the benefits of the production. And if that happens across an economy, it becomes a downward spiral. So
Definitely. I think wanted to get your opinion. I guess the wealth inequality has been growing for a very long time. How bad is it? Is it like reaching some critical points, or just not quite
yeah, I
there?
mean, and it's the turning point, was kind of in the late 70s, probably. I mean, people peg it at different times, 70s, 80s, where it really did start, diverging and become more extreme. Um, no one has like, oh, if the wealthiest have 80% of the income, is that the point? It's people don't, there's no magic number. It's kind of a continuum. So I don't know. I mean, we're certainly seeing signs of real problems. I mean, I would say that kind of a lot of the wealthiest people are sort of behaving with a certain disdain for everybody else right now that we haven't necessarily seen before. So maybe we're at that point. I don't
Yeah.
know. And it's gradual. It's like, on the power side of things. I mean, let me just say, of the things we were talking about, certainly there's still ample people still have income, at lower income levels that they can consume. So it's not like, and, you know, to be clear, we're like incomes at the bottom and the middle have grown, albeit not as fast as at the top. It's sort of the power side that you have to be concerned about right now because, I think it's striking that, Trump and Musk and, they're clearly just they're feeling like they have no constraints and kind of, I think if you see sort of the high income elite of the country, they're not really pushing back, and so that makes it starts to feel like we're at a position where there is this kind of, you know, overlords above us who are just sort of going to decide, right? And, I mean, I think how this little era we're in ends is, going to be very telling.
Yeah. Speaking of Musk, I feel like it was kind of satisfying to see the whole feud sort of happen after everything that he's been doing with the government.
Yeah, I mean, it had entertainment value. The thing about it is that, I mean, one is like pretty much anybody who ever does business with Trump ends up like having some problem, right?
Yeah.
Ends up on the outs with him, and I mean, I think, there's been all of this like, oh, who can hurt who worse and, all this stuff. I mean, at the end of the day, whatever Trump kind of, within the bounds of what I think is likely were to do to Musk, it's like, unless he locks him up, but Musk is going to end up being a fabulously wealthy man, right? I mean, he will be fabulously wealthy even if Tesla goes out of business. And so people have pointed out, yeah, they can, Trump could do things that would cost Musk billions of dollars. He'll still have billions of dollars after you take $1 billion away from me, I got problems. I don't have $1 billion to start with. You take $1 billion away from Musk, it's like, So I just like, but the question is whether Musk like backs up some of the things he's saying, particularly about, you mentioned the bill. I refuse to call it the big beautiful, but the tax and spending bill. You Musk could really cause them problems within the Republican Party if he wants to. Like Trump threatened him if he starts supporting Democrats. But I actually think the bigger thing he could do of consequence would be like going after Republicans who support it and threatening to go after Republicans that support it, on based on his, he wants smaller government, lower taxes, cut spending, like those things. And if he starts like funding opponents of Republicans in primaries who are more fiscally conservative and who don't, genuinely want to reduce the debt and deficits, I mean, that would cause Trump more trouble than anything, because then you start having the Republicans in Congress who got to vote for this thing start, looking over their shoulder, and they're think it's not like most of them don't have to worry about Democrats. but what can happen is they can start worrying about it, like attacks from the right, which could have salience. So I think if Musk wanted to spend his money politically that way, I think that he could really hurt the chances of that thing passing. Now whether
Yeah.
he, I don't know. I mean, the guy's
I think
pretty kooky
I
in his
guess he
own way.
also has power through his platform. And I think like this 30-year-old like male vote that we have seen play into this campaign, I think that's like Elon Musk supporters primarily, all of these like young
Really?
men
Yeah,
that like him.
I don't know.
I
I
don't
mean,
know.
yeah, I don't know whether it's Trump or Musk or like in this split, whether, I'm a little skeptical that, Musk peels off Trump supporters with him. I do think that his criticisms of the bill are something that's going to resonate though, because there is a portion of Republican voters who are like against increasing the federal debt, right? On this kind, especially on this kind of scale. And, so I think that message can appeal. Now, I also think, though, that the reality is that these elections are often decided by this narrow band of voters who, a lot of whom, aren't following all of this stuff the way you and I do. So, that's why I think it's like if Musk wants to spend his money and like go after this thing, he can make a difference that way.
Yeah. Speaking of I mean, how else to call it by its name, the bill that's big, beautiful bill. What are your thoughts on it, and what are the main components that people should really think about?
Well, there's a hunk of it. I mean, it's the big money, the big, cost to it is, very large, 70% of it or so goes to the richest 1%, and that's the big money, right? And then they've thrown in this tips thing and the overtime thing, and which are basically small potatoes. Um, and but then there are the cuts to Medicaid and sort of the other big spending increases on immigration enforcement, and then various sort of unspecified cuts sprinkled throughout it. So it's I mean it's definitely redistributional up. There's no question about that. So now whether
Yeah.
I think they've got the Republicans have problems because it's so close in the House. They need every vote, and there's sort of some narrow interest that some of their members are say they're going to stand up for, and then there's sort of broader concerns about the debt because some of them like genuinely do care about that, and are troubled by the amount that this just blows up the debt. And then some of them have, I mean, these Medicaid cuts are going to probably hit Republican districts more than Democratic districts, and one of the effects of Medicaid expansion was that it started hitting people that these members actually care about, so their voters. And so they've got challenges, and then they got pressure from the corporate community. A lot of the ways, I mean, they sort of do some things to limit, at least in the way on paper it looks, what it costs. And some of that is they make a bunch of these business things, corporate side cuts temporary. And I mean, which like there are things you can make temporary and it makes sense. These businesses, like I think the benefits of these business cuts are grossly exaggerated in terms of what they do to spur investment. But if you're in their mindset that that's why you're doing this is to spur investment, temporary cuts don't make a whole lot of sense because it's like you want them to make investments based, you want businesses to have some stability so they can make long-term plans to make the kinds of investments you're trying to encourage. And if it's temporary, I mean, they can make a bet that it's going to happen, but it sort of reduces it. I mean, I think just in general, I mean, we can talk about this more in other contexts, but the kind of instability that's really unprecedented. I mean, I remember when corporate leaders and, big investors were complaining under Obama that they were having a hard time to plan because of uncertainty, which I always thought was weird because Obama really didn't do anything he didn't say during the campaign he was going to do, and compared to anything uncertainty that these corporate leaders saw back then to now, it's like nothing, right? And so I just, and we're going to start seeing that the effects of that in the economy. You're just, I mean, I remember talking to this, I think he was a CFO, high ranking corporate guy, and he was just saying, and I think this is generally their attitude, is that, look, what we value most in some way, like we want lower taxes and less regulation, all that stuff, but like certainty is really, really important because their attitude is like, we can make money, we're smart, we're brilliant because we're rich and, whatever. We can like make money under any system of rules and regulations and taxation, but we need to know what it is. And um, I think like right now, it's like, is some big company going to make some huge investment when they don't know whether these tax cuts are permanent and temporary? They don't know whether tariffs are going to be 145% or 10% or nothing. There's just so much they don't. Are they going to have workers? I mean, if you're deporting 4% of the labor force, are they going to be able to find people to hire? You don't. It's a hard time to make a bet in an economic bet in the United States with any sense of confidence.
Yeah. No, that definitely makes sense. It's also, when I was reading through the components of the bill, it's strange to me that, like, it's just crazy that Trump is punishing almost everybody who has elected him in terms of the regular Americans that voted for him. I think the part that the SALT deductions, which I learned when I was reading it the couple of days ago, is when if you reside in New York City, you have really high taxes and you could pay less federal taxes because you have paid all of these like local taxes previously that was capped at $10,000. They want to increase it to $30,000 to $40,000. And just like people don't even like him in these places. I just thought that was surprising. Is that purely just sort of for his friends that live there?
No. So what has happened was, so it used to be completely uncapped. And it wasn't just for New York. I mean, it was everywhere in the country. You could take deductions for the taxes you paid. Because even, I mean, New Hampshire doesn't have an income tax, but people pay $20,000, $30,000 in property taxes. I mean, it tends to, people, I mean, there are higher taxes in lower tax places, but, and certainly it disproportionately hit bigger, wealthier, higher tax places. I mean, the other thing to remember is the cost of living in New York is for everything is higher, right? So to some extent, what it's hitting is just more expensive places, not just higher tax places, because it's a dollar limit. It's not like a percentage of the state's wealth or anything, right? It's just a fixed dollar amount. And $10,000 in New York City is a way different number than $10,000 in Brownsville, Texas, right? So anyway, I mean, the principle behind it, having that deduction, has been that someone who pays a lot of state and local income taxes has less ability to pay federal taxes because they have less money because of the state and local tax. It's sort of it's what's called a horizontal equity issue in tax policy. You're trying to calibrate it so people with equal ability to pay federal taxes, roughly pay the same amount in federal taxes. And one thing that affects them is what, someone paying, in a low tax state has more ability to pay than someone in a high tax state. So we're going to, balance that out. So the Republicans, partly to make the deficit numbers not look as high in 2017 when they passed the TCJA, the 27 tax bill, they put a cap on that of $10,000. So that was the first time there'd been a cap. And that raised money because people had less they could deduct. And no question, it disproportionately hit Democratic states, which are wealthier, higher income states and higher tax states, right? So, but for the most part, like there are House representatives, Republican House members from the suburbs of New York, who represent wealthier people who pay a lot more in taxes in New York, like who, their constituents are being hurt by this. So again, because the House is so close, there's a group, the SALT caucus, that are working hard to try to make sure that the Republicans at least, I mean, they'd love for the cap to completely go away. They know they're not going to get that, but what they're trying to get is it up to $40,000. So we'll see, because the Senate those guys pretty much don't represent any of the states that are hardest hit by it. So, they don't particularly want to raise it because it costs a bunch of money they could do to help other people in their states and corporations or whatever they want to do with the money. So it'll be an interest. I mean, I don't think Trump cares about it particularly. It's just that they need it to pass the House. So
Yeah. In just sort of like average size American cities and families that are somewhere in the very middle of the income level, if the bill is passed, how are they going to be affected? Are they going to notice anything? And what is it
they,
going to be?
I mean, they won't really notice anything. I mean, because one thing to remember is most the stuff that affects them is stuff that's an extension of what was done in 2017. It's not new things. So they will, they've been paying, whatever they've been paying since 2018 when the law went into effect. That's what they'll keep paying. It averts a small tax increase for them is what it does. And remember, everyone was sort of for that part of the bill. I mean, Biden was saying, we'll extend it, those cuts for people making less than 400,000 a year, So that part's sort of uncontroversial. But the thing that's controversial is, the vast bulk of the money that's going to higher income people. I mean, you do have these two things, the tipped worker thing and the overtime thing which, it doesn't have that much of an effect. I mean, overtime is sort of more of an upper middle income thing. I mean, it's higher paid union workers, who make a lot of, or people who work out on oil rigs and those guys make a lot of money, I mean, not CEO kind of money, but they make good money relative to most people. I mean, it'll be a break for that narrow band of people. And then tips, the thing is, so many people who worked in tip jobs don't actually pay any income tax because their incomes are so low or are at lower tax rates. And a lot of that income doesn't always get reported anyway. So, it'll have an effect for, I can tell from your smile, you've known people who've waited tables. But anyway, people it doesn't all get reported. So anyway, so it'll help out some people who are tipped workers in overtime, but not to a huge extent.
Yeah. I think, I guess, where the big feud is also happening is that Republicans has always been the ones who were more fiscally responsible, spending less, like on the government level. That was also a big promise of the Trump campaign. I got the numbers that currently we've paid $882 billion in just the interest from the debt that the government has, which is $36 trillion, which is equivalent to the entire Pentagon's budget or the cost, for example, for total Medicaid spending in 2023 was $890 billion, so pretty much the same. And we should really start thinking about paying off that debt, and now we're raising the ceiling for it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, those numbers sound about right. I haven't looked at them as recently as you have. Uh, I mean, one thing I would just say is Republicans haven't been typically more fiscally responsible. They've cut spending more, but not even that much. Whereas Democrats have tended to raise taxes, on higher income people and pay for their new things. So it's actually, if you look at it, it's like Democratic presidents, the debt has either stabilized or held constant usually. I mean, both Obama and Biden came in the middle of, economic disasters. So they spent a lot of money getting out of the disasters. But prior to Biden, Clinton and Obama were pretty damn fiscally responsible if you're just measuring that by the size of deficits. Whereas, every Republican president has passed giant unpaid for tax cuts. So in terms of driving up debts and deficit, it's definitely been Republican tax cuts that are a lot more responsible for our current level of debt than Democratic spending initiatives. In terms of yeah, I mean, we need to raise the debt limit just because we can't just balance the budget today, right? I mean, that would be hugely traumatic to the economy, to say the least. But so we need to raise the debt limit. But the thing is, we don't need to pass legislation that massively increases our deficits, by giving huge amounts of tax cuts to higher income people and corporations. We don't need to do that. And particularly now. And yeah, the fact, whatever Trump says, he says a lot of things. And now they're running around and saying the tariffs are going to pay for it. It's just nonsense. It's just, this is hugely costly. And you sort of, every we haven't had yet the disaster that people keep predicting if our debt gets too high, right? We've never gotten to that point. Um, at some point we are going to get to that point. We would get to that point. I don't know what that point is exactly. It always, but this seems like real playing with fire. And it's doubly playing with fire because we really rely on other countries to lend us the money to pay for the debt, right? And Trump, going out of his way to antagonize every other country in the world, is not necessarily conducive to other countries thinking that the U.S. and creating a chaotic economy is not really conducive to other countries just wanting to buy our debt, but also being comfortable that this is the safe harbor it's always been. When Trump talks about going after the Federal Reserve, he just says all of these things that if you want to scare off potential investors in U.S. debt, like, that's the way to do it. Now, what's going to happen? I don't know, but it's just like it's playing with fire right now.
Yeah. So when US lost its AAA ranking on its debt, I feel like it still sort of doesn't mean anything, right? So far, it's like not bad enough, but wanted to also hear your thoughts on that.
Well, the thing that's different, people like say, oh, like Greece or these countries that have, gone through fiscal crises and because they've been so in debt. The U.S. is different in the sense that our debt is all in dollars, right? When other countries borrow money, they often their debt is often owed in dollars. So if they don't have enough dollars, they can't pay the debt. The U.S., in some ways, the loss of a AAA rating is silly because the U.S. will be able to pay off its debts. All we have to do is print more dollars. And like almost, we don't print them, but, literally, we just have to create more dollars, which the government can just say, the government writ large, you'd have to have the Fed go along. It's complicated, but we can never go bankrupt because the money we owe, we can just create out of thin air. Now, there's really bad consequences if we do it, in the sense that it's inflationary, it undermines confidence. No one would want to lend us money again in dollars because they'd be like, wait a minute, you just made these dollars worth half as much by printing, money just to give to it, So it's not a winning thing. But people talk about a foreclosure or compare to these other countries. It's actually a very different situation. So, and the reaction you get is like, but what you do get is, higher interest rates and which can drag down the economy. There's lots of bad things can happen. It's not literally, being foreclosed on.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's kind of interesting. When I was taking my econ class, I think maybe it was like an intro and we were talking about debt. And there was like a cartoon of a bridge and a little boy and his dad. And he was like, how like big of a truck can this bridge handle? And he's like, well, we don't know. We just keep driving bigger and bigger truck and see when the bridge collapses. And I guess like, yes, the fiat currency situation helps us a lot, but when is that point where we have to be just super concerned?
Yeah, and if it happens, it can get bad fast. That is true. So the bridge collapsing isn't the worst, simile.
I feel like as a young person, I'm like, what does it mean for me that the debt keeps growing? I guess like, what is it going to look like once we're serious about repaying the debt? I guess who's going to be carrying the biggest burden of that?
Those are choices. You can raise taxes on whoever you want. You can cut spending on, who you're gonna, who you want to. I think, uh, a lot of it just depends on, one of the reasons we've been able to survive this long is we haven't grown ourselves out of the debt, but a lot of what's kept things a little under control is the fact that overall we've had a like expanding economy. The economy's done reasonably well. So that kind of like you can grow yourself out of a certain amount of debt, right? The economy grows, tax revenues go up, social welfare spending can go down, so you can kind of grow yourself out of the problem at some point. The problem, and to some extent, that's the bet people have made. But it's like at some point, it's like, wait a minute, we can't grow ourselves out of that much debt, in this, in sort of in a globalized economy like that. Like the U.S. is not going to outperform the rest of the world economically by a factor of 5, right? And when it gets up to that kind of thing, it becomes, it's just then you can't do it anymore, and you end up having to tighten your belt to pay for it. And we've been lucky uh, to get away with it. I mean, like I think you could, if we had rational decision makers, and I'm not necessarily Biden. I mean, one thing that happened under Biden, which I completely understand, was like it had been this cycle where the Republicans would come in and they'd massively cut taxes for their constituency, and so we see these big tax cuts for the rich and corporations. Deficit would go up like this, and then Democrat would come in and be like, "Oh yeah, I got this long list of programs, but we can't do them because we have too big deficits." So Democrats would sort of constrain their spending ambitions, raise taxes, which even if you're for raising taxes on the rich and corporations, like you don't gain a lot of politically by doing that, unless you can spend it on something. And then Republican would come in, deficit or cut taxes. So Biden and I completely get this. Like basically my interpretation of it is it came in as like, you know what? Screw it. I'm going to hand off a debt to the we're going to do the policies that I think are right. We're going to be probably more fiscally responsible than Republicans, but we are not going to stop doing the Democratic agenda because of deficits. The Republicans never do it, and we end up having to pay the bill, right? So I think, that was a lot of the thinking in the Biden administration. And then, so, at this point, I don't, who's going to be the grown up at the table in charge and say, wait a minute, we've got to address this and come up with some serious law, because having a plan would go a long way to keeping the markets calm. Just because okay, they've recognized the debt's too high. We need to like have some trajectory to at least stabilize it. I mean, and then okay, we'll keep investing in the United States, but who's going to do that? I mean, it's doable if people want to do it. And there were efforts. Obama had his deficit commission. There were earlier efforts, and they all kind of had pretty limited success, but they did sort of calm things down. And the other thing I just want to sorry, I seem to be giving long answers to your questions, but the other thing that I'll say is that not all tax cuts that increase the deficit are bad, and not all spending increases that increase the deficit are bad. I mean, if you are spending the money in ways that have returns on the investment that help you, that further growing out of the problem, like that's fine. That's the kind of deficit spending you should be doing, because it's going to be self-defeating if you we're going to balance the budget right now. Like if we did that, it'd crash the economy, and you get the opposite. We shrink ourselves into even worse of a problem. So
yeah, that definitely makes sense. I wanted to speculate more about all kinds of policy we could do to improve the situation economically, but I also wanted to first touch on tariffs before we go into that. You also wrote about the effects of that. Now that we have all of these deals happening and seems that tariffs aren't going to be as aggressive as we initially predicted, what can we still expect to see the effect on the economy, and how much of the actual revenue are we going to receive from those tariffs?
you think I know what Donald Trump's thinking? I mean, yeah, it's like been very veer, right? And I think the Chinese have not, just capitulated. They haven't just said, okay, well, we'll give you everything. And it's. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. Obviously, I don't think anybody does. I think that the thing, all of the things that the Trump administration are saying will happen can't all happen, right? So you can't both pay for the big tax budget bill with tariffs and manufacturing all comes back to the United States, right? Because if it all comes back to the United States, you're not collecting money from the tariffs. So, and people in other countries are not going to pay the tariffs. I mean, it's going to raise prices in the United States, and it's also going to lower profitability of U.S. companies. Now, that's not to say obviously some companies will benefit and some individuals will benefit, but overall, American consumers will pay more and American corporate profits will be lower. Both those things will happen. And I'm not saying, the exporters in other countries won't adjust their prices some, but it's not like they're operating on these huge margins, where they can just, we're going to cut prices, So, it's just, and, again, I think those things are fairly straightforward. It's a tax on imports. So people who buy imports, which is all of us, are going to pay more. I mean, it's kind of obvious. I do think one thing that's missed, though, is just the chaos, which I won't go into again. I already described, but like the chaos it's introducing into markets, which is going to undermine investment and hiring decisions and everything else.
Yeah. I heard, like, I guess the conspiracy thought that the whole reason this chaos exists is so people who know sort of Trump's closest allies are able to capitalize on the markets that are going crazy. And we've already seen that whenever there is a like tariff introduced, the market dips a little bit. And then some people started buying the dip because then the deal's going to come in and hopefully like everything's going to be better.
So, I mean, I would be shocked if Trump is not personally making money off this through someone doing it. Just the reason is, I mean, people forget about this, that, Trump had businesses, lost, they went bust. He came back, lost, had businesses, they went bust, they came back. One of those cycles, the way he came back was that he would like buy some stock in a company. Then he would like leak that he was thinking of buying the company because people thought he had more money than he did, and so then the stock would go up because they think there's this hostile takeover going to be coming in. Someone's going to be buying all the stock. Then he'd sell the stock. And at some point, the market figured out that he was, full of it. He wasn't really doing a takeover. So that stopped working. But he made a ton of money doing that game. So it's not like this idea is not in his head about manipulating the market to make money. So I have no evidence, but given that history, given that I don't think he particularly has any personal constraints on his, on what he does to make money, I would be shocked if like these announcements are not getting into the heads of people who can make money for Trump. His kids, I don't know. But like I would be shocked if he's not making money off these swings.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Like, I get a person like Elon Musk still being very greedy about everything and just like trying to grow his wealth. But like with Donald Trump, he's already, it's like an old guy kind of. He already has so much money. I'm always curious to see such like financial motivations when, I mean, you can't spend it all at this point. All the kids are already wealthy, but,
Well, there's always questions about how exactly wealthy he is, but I will say this: I once a long time ago when Wall Street bonuses were like getting really big, and some reporter asked one of these Wall Street guys who'd gotten some big bonuses, and it was just like, it's sort of to your point. It's like at some point you have more money than you could possibly, you and the next three generations of your family could just possibly spend, right? You just can't. I mean, spend $1 million a day for the rest of your life. It's just like you can't spend it. And so they asked this guy, like, why is there all this escalating bonuses? Why do you care about making any more money? And he said, once you get to this level, it's just keeping score. Meaning like it was just you wanted to get more bonus than the other guy just because then you win, right? In their game. So I think some of them may just be keeping score. And it's
Yeah.
power, if you're
Yeah,
lust for
yeah,
power.
that's what I like. That's what I see with like Elon Musk. He's, I don't know, like maybe he wants to play all these power games. He has the big plan, so he like needs this enormous wealth. But like, I don't know, like I feel like Trump just has to retire after this president. Like, there's not much he could do with but anyhow, I also wanted to talk about some of the people, like smaller groups that are going to be affected by the tariffs the most. I feel like what I hear the most about is like farmers, for example, also a group of people that's overwhelmingly like supported Trump. And now, I mean, all of this equipment is going to be more expensive for them. Less countries are going to buy their goods, and farmers are extremely dependent on this like long-term planning. So this unpredictability, I feel like, is even more damaging for them um, than some of the corporations. What are going to be like the groups, in your opinion, that you think are going to be just like worse off more than anybody else?
Well, I mean, farmers, I think the big impact is just retaliatory tariffs from other countries, right? And I mean, I mean, so yeah, and any exporters, any exporters are potentially hurt. Um, and you know, I'm not sure that, any business that relies heavily on imports, I mean, either to sell or as inputs, the steel and aluminum tariffs, like, are just, Kansas beer and soda. It's just like the metals and everything, right? And it's just going to raise the price on all those things, which is going to hurt those businesses. Either it's going to come out of their profits, or they're going to have to pass on the cost to consumers, and consumers won't buy as much, right? So I think, those are things that, anybody who's exposed to international markets, which, it's different than, I don't know, even 30 years ago, right? That it's just everybody is exposed to international markets because it really is a globalized economy with stuff crossing borders both directions all the time. So, um, yeah, it's hard to like pinpoint. I mean, farmers in the certain types of farmers in the U.S. are very exposed to export. So they're certainly a group.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, probably as a percent of the total output of that industry, agriculture, probably farming is like a very high percentage of its export relative to other industries in the U.S.
Yeah. Well, now I wanted to go into possible other solutions that are currently not being entertained as much by the government that would be facing sort of forward looking and ensuring that United States sort of it's like forward looking prosperity today and also into the long run. What are some of the things that you think we should be implementing?
Where to start? I, you know, I mean, one thing is there are like investments that should be made, right? And I think what the Biden administration did with clean energy investments, which Trump wants to roll back, and the CHIPS Act, which Trump wants to roll back. I mean, those are ways to sort of address the problem of kind of restoring and rejuvenating a U.S. manufacturing base or expanding it. That sort of aren't on the backs of American consumers, and it's in a way it's like Trump's plan for re-energizing and boosting American manufacturing is to punish American consumers. The Biden plan was to tax rich people and corporations and invest it in targeted ways on industries where we had a leg up to start, so it's likely to, or it's sort of new, so we have a better chance than like this idea that we're going to start making iPads in the United and iPhones in the United States again, which just isn't practical in any near term way. So, so I think just in general, doing those kinds of investments smartly would be a good thing. I'm not generally, I have not been a deficit hawk, like, we got to get the debt down, but, not doing what Trump does, or when this, like, in a like you need to undo at least after this stuff passes, you need to undo some of that stuff to address it, and to there's room to raise taxes also on high income people and in corporations to make the kind of investments I described, and also just to like the healthcare system. I mean, Obamacare was great, but it was brand new, and we haven't tinkered with it nearly as much as we should since then, right? I mean, there's a lot of lessons learned about it, and it could work better. But just those, and like people realize that. I mean, Democrats have sort of shied away from it because they don't want to criticize something that was such a signature thing of a Democratic president, and the Republicans want to get rid of it. So we haven't really seen like tuning it up, which really needs to be done. I mean, you're not going to get something that big exactly right on first crack, right? So, I mean, I think those are things. I do think, I mean, you can stick your head in the sand, but climate change is coming, and we need to A, do what we can to slow it down, and B, be ready for it. Because, like, at this point, it's happening. I mean, it's not like there was an opportunity to really address it, but I mean, to my mind, when I look at it, it's just like, I mean, we have the two biggest economies in the world kind of walking away from it, and that's not good. Um, so, we need to do that stuff. Healthcare, energy. I mean, I think education, I think that like how we've dealt with really all these kids who lost a year a year or more of education because of COVID effectively. I mean, the test scores in a lot of states, it's just like appalling. And we really haven't made the investment we need to make. And some states are having more success than others at this because they're things people know about how to do this. And it really needs to be done, because otherwise, I mean, they're not getting that year back. Like it's the problems are persisting. And if you talk to teachers, they see it. So,
Yeah.
sorry, my
Yeah, I
screen.
talked to a teacher, I think like a year ago, just like we were hanging out, and one of my friends, I think is like a middle school teacher. He's like, yeah, kids just are falling behind in like tremendously. They're on social media like TikTok, I think in particular during classes, and the difference is insane.
Yeah.
Um,
I think,
yeah.
the other thing I was just going to say is, I mean, it's insane that Trump's like rolling back all this health and safety stuff. I was disappointed that Biden made a very strong like war on cancer thing, and it's just like, I mean, you want to do things that are going to affect people's lives. I mean, we've got a lunatic in charge of HH, in Kennedy right now, but like, and he's going to make things worse. But it's just, you know, I mean, cancer rates have risen, and it's just like, and we need more research, not less research, and there's smart things that can be done to be addressing that. I mean, there's a lot more we know about the chemicals around us and all that stuff. So, health stuff. Um, yeah, I mean, I think when I get my full agenda, I'll send it to you. Those are some
Perfect.
things. Those are some. I'm sure I'm missing some. Well, let me just say the other thing is we really do need to get immigration right, um, because it's been a train wreck, and um, uh, it's. I mean, there were good answers on the table, but Trump blew it all up. I mean, there was bipartisan. They never quite got it done, but there were certainly people on both sides who were willing to make the leap and do what needs to be done, which is, normalize the status of people who've been here a long time or came here as children, and and then come up with a new set of rules for the border for further immigration, and that needs to be done in a serious way. And there were people who recognized that and were willing to talk to the table. But then, once Trump started saying they're all thieves and criminals and murderers and rapists, it just made it too hard for Republicans to step up and join that. I mean, one thing I hadn't realized was that the groundwork had been laid for that in right-wing media for a while before, which had made it harder and harder for Republicans even before Trump to climb on board. But at least there were some still willing to. But now I mean, it's horrible. We got 4% of our workforce are just living these underground existences, which is terrible. And now it's not like we got people lining up to go pick our crops or swing hammers on scaffolds or, it's, we need those people.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
they're good people.
Um,
Most overwhelmingly, they're good people just trying to, make it.
yeah, I think 2 times lower crime rates amongst immigrants than
Yeah.
the like
The,
average
the
American
thing
like
is, the
among
thing
them.
is, like, reasonable minds can differ on immigration policy, right? I mean, how many people should be let into the country, under what circumstances? The world's changed since the asylum laws were written. You can make arguments for changing this. Like, I'm not going to, say people are bad people for thinking we should address immigration policy, but it's just been shameful, the like vilification of people who are overwhelmingly just trying to make better lives for themselves and their families. That's why they're coming. I mean, and some of them and many who are escaping legitimate threats to their lives. It's just, I think that has just been disgusting.
Yeah, I immigration has been a bipartisan issue, and Reagan actually is the one who I think who initially came up with the idea that people that's been here for more than
Well,
10
he did
years
it.
could just get their legal
He
status.
did it. I mean, they passed a law. One of the reactions from the right is that they did do a deal then, which did legalize a lot of people, and then put in some constraints on immigration. And like the anti-immigration people say, well, we can't do that again because that didn't end up working. But first of all, it did work for a while, and second of all, like any policy things, like some of the things worked and some of the things didn't work. So the answer isn't just to like, okay, let's deport them all. The answer is to, like we learned from that, do things differently this time. And also the circumstances like completely changed. Like in their mindset in whatever year it was, 86, 87, 85, somewhere in the 80s, when they did that, like the whole nature of immigration changed. So that law, sure, it didn't work because the circumstances changed and you didn't pass laws to address the new circumstances. Well, let's pass laws to address the new circumstances.
Yeah.
So
The reform I really wanted to talk with you about is how can we better tax rich people as well as how can we better tax corporations? I think maybe we could start with just the wealthy individuals. I think the debate that was more vibrant in 2016 of can we tax wealth, especially on the level of like billionaires, given that it's tied up in assets, how can we do it effectively?
So I have two answers to that. Specifically on the wealth tax, I have two answers. One is there's real questions about whether the Supreme Court would find it constitutional. And it's not the position that it's not constitutional is not crazy. And so personally, I have not invested a ton of effort specifically on wealth taxes because I think it's like if you want to spend all your political capital on trying to tax high income people, I'd rather do something that isn't going to like have at best, and with this Supreme Court, I don't know what the odds of it being found constitutional are, but I would think they're small. So, so that's one answer. I mean, the other answer is great. Let's tax wealth. you know, again, I'm all for taxing people based on their ability to pay, and wealth is often a better measure of ability to pay than income. You can have, people can have, in given years, not have a lot of income, but still have, relatively speaking, to their wealth. So, there are problems, in other countries that face problems with evasion. One nice thing about income is if uh, cheating on people cheat on income taxes, but at a high level, if you're getting decent auditing, you have to have two people conspire to cheat on it, because one person's paying and one person's receiving. And if those two numbers don't line up, IRS is going to notice if they're doing their job. So, whereas a wealth tax, there's always been problems with evasion issues. But I still think that it is a better tax, and you could design it in a way that, you only hit a very elite band of people with fantastic wealth. It's hard. They might hide some of it, but they're not going to hide all of it. And, I think you could design an effective tax on that. But there are other kinds
Yeah.
of taxes that which I could talk about. I mean, some of it's just like we should tax capital gains at a higher rate. That's income from wealth, right? We can start taxing unrealized capital gains. So the amount that property is increased in value. We can certainly get rid of what's called stepped up basis. So if I die and leave you $10,000 in stock, let's say I bought stock for $1,000. I die, I leave you $11,000 in stock because it's increased by $10,000, and you sell it, you don't have to pay any capital gains on it. There's no tax on it. If I sold it before I died, I'd have to pay tax on $10,000 because that's my gain, right? But heirs inherit it at, it's called the basis, at $11,000. If you held it and it gained another $2,000, you have to pay tax on that, but you don't have to pay any tax on any gains. And it's a huge loophole for wealthy families because they just hand down stock and stuff over the years, and boom, it just like the basis goes up and it get a reset. So, we should definitely get rid of stepped up basis. I think, estate tax has been decimated and that could be restored. I mean, and they make all these claims it hurts farmers and small business. There's tons of accommodations for them. No one is. Someone asked one of the lobbyists who was advocating on supposedly representing farmers who were opposed to the estate tax, and has anyone actually sold a farm to pay estate tax? And he couldn't come up with anybody, And it's like, I don't know, maybe someone has, but it's just like there's a lot of ways that can be designed and has been designed to stop people from selling the family farm in these sympathetic cases, So, estate tax would definitely be something that we should get at. So those are some things you could do. And you could just go back to the old rates too,
What do you think about, there's so many loopholes right now for rich people to get away from having to also pay taxes on the income they have, or often they take out loans to sort of pay for their expenses, and it's like, I don't know, attached to the assets that they have. Sometimes I feel like there are almost too many different loopholes in our law to protect wealthy people from those taxes. Has there been an attempt, like a fair attempt to reform that? And can it even be reformed, or with good accountants and lawyers, you'll just always end up finding a way to avoid it? Reform it in such a way so it doesn't actually hurt the potentially good reasons why those loopholes were there in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be an element of whack-a-mole. It's just like, accountants will come up with something and, you come down away. I mean, you could certainly simplify the tax system, which would make it a lot harder to play those games. I mean, we have all these different investment vehicles, IRAs, you create IRAs, and then people with closely held companies realize this is a great way to, hide all their income for decades. And, so you have all of these things. And as you say, some of them are, well-intentioned. I mean, one thing is a lot of these things you could put income limits on them and put more constraints so they really are more targeted to the benefit of, more moderate income people. Capital gains, raising the rate on capital gains would have a big impact on getting rid of stepped up basis, because a lot of what these loopholes do are tricks to turn other forms of income into capital gains, so you can take that income at a lower, so you can pay taxes at a lower rate or avoid taxes. So, I mean, and a lot of it is also just, Biden ramped up enforcement on higher income people, and that makes a big difference. It's kind of become it's gotten worse in terms of enforcement over the years. Yeah.
In terms of taxing corporations, I think also, especially as we have tech giants that just sell software, what we often see is that, I don't know, everybody has their headquarters in Ireland right now, but they're very much I feel like American companies, and they should be paying taxes in the United States. Are there solutions, or are they just sort of, they're always can we bring them sort of back to pay to the country in which market they have sort of built their wealth?
I mean, there's lots of potential solutions. The thing is, TCJA just went in the exact opposite direction. I mean, the 2017 tax bill just opened up greater opportunity to shift income into other countries without paying a price. That's corporate tax gets very complicated very fast. It used to be that although companies could hide income overseas and avoid paying U.S. tax, there were practical limits to the amount they could do that. Let's just leave it at that. Whereas TCJA closed a couple of little things, but basically the 27 tax bill created a lot more opportunity to do that, painlessly for the companies. We're probably not going back to the old system, but you could certainly do things. There's, within states, so the way state corporate income taxes work basically is you take their U.S. income and then you allocate it among states. These days, usually just by the proportionate of their proportion of their sales in a state. Historically, it was a three-factor formula. It's a combination of sales, the amount of property they had in the state, and the amount of payroll they had in the state. But now it's evolved, so it's mostly sales. I mean, you could do international taxation the same way, right? I mean, take their global profits. I mean, the key is you kind of need to start with a corporation's global profits and then decide where it goes. Where you get into trouble and what the 2017 tax bill made easier was companies that are just have subsidiaries in different countries. If they sort of get to do some accounting and say, oh, this is where the profits were made, this is where they, it's just it's impossible to effectively police that. But if you start with global profits and then you use something like sales to say that how you apportion that income to where it's taxed, I mean, that would work.
Yeah. An idea I've heard is that, because now there are also all of these other companies that technically own the intellectual property of Meta, for example, and then Meta pays them a bunch, and that company's perfectly registered in Ireland, so it's all good technically. So many ways to avoid it. Something that he sort of came up with is that if you sell this ad in the state of Texas, for example, you have to pay a sales tax. So instead of taxing profits, you're more focused on taxing sales at the point of when they're happening, because if you have to pay to access a certain market no matter where you're located.
So I think this gets complicated, but the problem is, so the traditional assumption, which I think largely holds true, is that if you tax sales, it ends up going into higher prices for consumers, and if you tax profits, that tends to be paid more by the shareholders in the company, higher income people. So it's like companies don't pay taxes. They're either going to pass it on to their shareholder, it's either going to have lower returns to their shareholders, higher prices for the consumers, or lower pay for their employees. And there's lots of economic literature on how different taxes end up, in those three different places. And, I sort of go with a simpler approach, which is I look what I figure these companies, they probably have smarter economists than me, and because they pay really well. So, and they, you look at what they lobby on, what they fight the most are corporate income taxes. So you got to figure that those are the ones which is also the traditional assumption that it's the shareholders who are paying that. So, sales is simpler. I would much rather see corporate profits allocated by sales. And I think you get a different incidence result with that than if you just do a sales tax per se. Or you could do something like what was traditionally done, allocate it not just by sales, but by sales, payroll, the amount of property they own, concrete things you can measure to decide where the corporate, where the tax is paid.
Yeah. What do you think it's gotten worse in terms of companies being able to hide how much their true income is with all of the schemes with this third companies abroad and intellectual rights like manipulations.
I mean, that's been true for a long, long time. It's what happened was, um, I'm really trying to not go into the details of how the corporate income tax works, but or did work. But the what changed, and TC 2017 tax bill did do some things to stop some practices, but overall, it made it much more profitable to do that kind of shifting. So it used to be basically the way the U.S. tax system worked. It was in theory, we did tax U.S. corporations, domestic U.S. corporations, on their worldwide income. But if it was income that was earned by a foreign subsidiary, they didn't have to pay taxes on it until it was brought back to the United States. And there were all sorts of ways they could borrow against. There were all sorts of schemes they did to keep their money in their foreign subsidiaries, especially in low tax places. But the fact that if they brought it back, like they wanted to bring it back to pay a dividend, or whatever, was a little bit, and like they'd borrow against it so they'd have access to the money without bringing it back. But like there was a limit that people don't want to see huge amounts of debt in a company. So there were like reasons still. You didn't want to shift too much of your income to other countries because you had this problem that if to bring it back to the parent company, you'd have to pay tax if you did it. So there was a disincentive to moving it. It wasn't a strong enough disincentive to stop it, but it was at least somewhat of a constraint. Yeah. The system now, it's what's called a territorial system, which is there's no pretense of taxing worldwide income. You're just taxing the profits earned in the United States, And your example of, a company puts its intellectual property in a subsidiary that in a country that doesn't tax profits to intellectual property, and then its home company in the United States pays enormous royalties to to its subsidiary, and then it's like, oh, we have no profits here in the United States because we paid all this money for the intellectual property rights. It's a huge expense, So yeah. That kind of game. But it also happens in like smaller examples, like just anything, like it can happen in goods, right? So you can have a company that makes its laptops outside of the United States, imports them, but they get to decide how much they say they're paying their subsidiary in the other country that does the manufacturing. And so it's the same thing. That's a little more easily measured in the sense that there are IRS people who say, wait a minute, you're not paying that much, but it's still they stretch it as far as they can, right? So under the old system, they could do it, but there was some disincentive to doing it. Under the new system, it's basically the disincentive was that, again, as I said, if you ever wanted to bring the money back, you'd have to pay a tax. Now you never have to pay a tax to bring it back. So there's no disincentive to do it to the level that you're doing it. And, they did put somewhat of a limit on the worst examples of tax sheltering where it's like a country where you really do no business, but because they recognize this could be like ridiculous. But overall, it created more of a license to, play these games.
I feel like there's a lot of people feel this sort of helplessness where the regular people get taxed always. There's nothing you could do to avoid it, especially if you're like a doctor or a lawyer. Rates are really high for you. And then you have these really wealthy companies, corporations, really wealthy individuals, and they're the ones paying almost like no tax. And then you call sort of to reform it, and people are like, well, they're just going to move, they're just going to leave, we can't change anything. So is it true, or is it like, are there tools available that economists know about to be able to both tax the hyper rich individuals as well as corporations, and nobody just wants to implement them? Or is there sort of truth to sort of that helplessness situation?
So one thing I'll say is I'm for higher taxes on high income people, and I'm for higher taxes on corporations. It's not like they don't pay any tax. For the most part. Some do. Some are able to completely evade paying taxes, but lots of high income people pay lots of taxes, do they pay enough? I don't think so, considering how fabulously wealthy they are. they could pay more, and we have needs in this country, and taxing them another 10, 20, 30, $50,000 is like going to have no impact on their lives, whereas if you tax a middle income person $1,000 more, it has a meaningful impact on their lives. So it's like, I think as a matter of equity, we should tax them more. And there are a ton of loopholes and a ton of ways that very high income people do evade taxes, and some completely. But they don't pay nothing, and neither do most corporations in most years. So I just wanted to, it's a big problem, but it's not quite as bad as you were saying.
Yeah.
So now, do they move? No. I mean, is the short answer, it's not. I mean, one of the good things that was done was that it's very hard and expensive for a company to move its domicile to another country now. It used to be easier, but it's called an inversion technique for doing it. Basically, you get a foreign subsidiary to buy the parent, and then all of a sudden you're in another country. But they did make that. I guess it was under Obama. I'm not sure, but that's more expensive and harder than it used to be. And in any case, it was never free. I mean, there were just costs to it, not not a tax cost, but there were just costs to it. So companies don't generally do that, and they can't abandon the U.S. market either. I mean, the thing to remember is foreign companies pay U.S. tax too when they do business here. So if you had a corporate income tax that was allocating profits appropriately for both domestic and foreign companies, it doesn't matter as much whether they move, because they're not going to abandon the U.S. market. So that's on the company side. On the individual side, I mean, I always made this joke. I used to do a lot of state and local tax work, and I sort of made a joke that it's like, what's the point of being filthy rich if every time some legislature raises your marginal tax rate by 2 points, you had to move, It's not that funny a joke. But the point is, it's like the point of being rich is you can live wherever the hell you want to, and do whatever you want to do. And so this idea that people are going to move to a place they less want to live in because they're paying another $50,000-$60,000 a year in taxes when their income is $30 million a year or whatever it is. I mean, it just, and there's no evidence that it happens. So and even among states, anytime a state raises its taxes, it's like, oh, all these rich people are going to leave. And I'm not saying no rich person moves to Florida to avoid New York income tax. It happens, but just statistically, when you actually look at it, still a ton of rich people living in New York, right? And in California. It's not like they all moved to South Dakota, to avoid the income tax. So I just it's hugely overblown. I mean, there's probably a tax rate where that would happen, but we are so far short of that being the level of taxation that there's going to be a mass exodus of the wealthy from this country that it's on the list of concerns, very low.
Yeah. If you, it's a question I ask all of my guests. If you could tackle one issue and pass a law specifically focused on that, what legislation would it be?
Is impeachment a law? Wanted to think of one thing it doesn't really solve problems, but it prevents what I feel like may be a complete disaster, not only for the country but for the world.
Yeah.
That is a really hard. I mean, right now I'm just I've been doing a lot of immigration work, so probably could tell earlier, I kind of feel passionately about that. So that's we have a lot of things we need to do. What are some other answers you've gotten?
Well, I actually have gotten from the immigration episode, I have gotten an answer on immigration for the DACA recipients to just have full resolution, I guess, of their situation was the answer from Professor Perlman.
Now, that's a little modest. You got to go more beyond DACA. You got to get the deal that was on the table, bipartisan deal that was on the table before, which was DACA plus, anyone who'd lived here, paid taxes, blah blah blah, for a certain period of time. I mean, you do the country a lot of good if you did a massive tax reform bill. I mean, it's not like doing one thing isn't going to matter. You'd really need a huge tax reform bill. continuing the I mean, I think the Biden administration did a really good job of investing in clean energy. I mean, to some extent, that, like, I'm not saying we solved it, but it's like probably there's not a ton more to do there until you'd see how those things start to play out. Um, as I said, tuning up the health system would be really important to people. Um, yeah, I don't know. I can't pick one. We got a lot of things we need to do.
Yeah. Fair. Yeah, I like the immigration one. I feel like I know a lot of international people who, for college, went to all kinds of different places, and it's just like US is really behind from any developed country in terms of like the immigration policy. It's the difference with the United Kingdom is insane. The work authorization, for example, papers that it takes here about 4 months to receive takes like 4 days in the
Well,
UK, which
one thing
is
is, I mean, it's complex and hard, and it may not be one law, but like, I have Brit friends, and and just we do underfund the public sector in this country relative to all these other countries. Like, I suspect the 4 months worth is 4 days may not be about as much about the law but about the UK actually has enough people processing the paperwork, maybe not. I mean, there could be more reviews here and whatever, but it's like, if you go to other countries, well-run countries with, good public sectors, I mean, we have lots of public sector workers who are trying really hard and doing their best, but we underfund our public sector. So it's like, things take a long time. They're not done efficiently. We also give less freedom to the people to make decisions. Everything's very bureaucratic and structured, and the reasons for that. So, just making our government, more functional would be, I mean, it relates to immigration. I mean, we don't have enough immigration judges. So that's one of the reasons why people are just released into the country, is like we don't have judges to, assess asylum cases. And like, there's a ton of that kind of investment. I mean, just in general, I mean, the U.S. spends less as a share of our economy than all but a handful of, developed country, advanced economy countries, the OECD developed countries. We just spend way, way less on government. And Americans don't really realize that. And a hunk of that is healthcare, because all those countries have public healthcare systems. But even if you take out healthcare, it's like we're still way, way below. I mean, partly because because our healthcare system's so inefficient. This is one of my least favorite statistics, maybe. Like, we spend as much on health, our government spends as much on healthcare as like a lot of these other countries, but we only provide healthcare to the poor and the elderly, and they provide it to everybody, because we have such a bloated and inefficient healthcare system. So, like, taking the next step to fixing that would have a huge effect, both fiscally, and just in terms of people's well-being. Sorry, I'm not like an immigration guy. I'm not a tax guy. I'm an everything guy. So I can't pick one thing. It's not fair. The nice thing about
no.
immigration is you can parameterize it. Like, you can come up with a policy that, like, might have a chance in a somewhat different world of actually passing, that would make huge strides to addressing the problem. So all this other stuff's more complicated.
Yeah. That's fair. Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed
Sure,
our
I enjoyed it.
conversation.